ask you to put up your slides and
Okay.
get started.
Okay. Okay, just a minute. Okay, everybody, I'm excited to do this, all right? Say Tim Prosdick. Okay, hold it. I want to get my slides up. Okay, hold it, share down here in the right corner. Okay, I'm
Looks
getting
good.
there, everybody. I'm getting there. Let's do it this way right here, slideshow from beginning. Okay, welcome everybody. Glad to have you on board. You all intellectually, biblically curious people. The title of the talk is Who Wrote the Four Gospels and Do They Reliably Describe What Jesus Actually Said or Did? Most of my talk I've taken from Bart Ehrman's book, which was a New Times bestseller, Misquoting Jesus, the story behind who changed the Bible and why. So this is a study of how a textual critic interprets contradictions in the four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but with an emphasis on the Gospel of Mark. Now, for instance, you may be reading your St. James Bible and you read the Gospel of Mark and you say, Scott, what are you talking about? Contradictions within the Gospel of Mark. I don't understand. To illustrate what I'm going to be doing in this talk, I'm going to take almost my last slide and I'm going to share it with you now so you see where I am going, okay? We'll be getting to this, but just for right now, take for granted that there are thousands of manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark copied from the first century all the way up to the time when Johann Gutenberg invented the printing press in 1440. So thousands of manuscripts of Mark. And this is a textual problem that a textual critic typically addresses, and this is from Mark chapter 1, verse 41. And the story is the leper and Jesus healing him. And it reads, as you can see, and the leper came to him, him being Jesus, beseeching him and saying to him, if you wish, you are able to cleanse me. And some transcripts say, feeling compassion, Jesus reached out his hand, touched him, and said, I wish be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy went out of him, and he was cleansed. However, some transcripts, manuscripts of Mark say, becoming angry. And becoming angry, Jesus reached out his hand, touched him, and said, I wish be cleansed. So the question is, which is it? Which is correct? One of those versions is wrong. Was Jesus either angry or was he compassionate? And in order to answer that question, which I'll be doing by the time we get to the end of this presentation, in order to resolve this textual conflict, we need to know how the New Testament came into existence and how it evolved over hundreds of years. So towards that end, let's define what textual criticism means. As Lou said, God is not on trial here. We're approaching the Bible as a historical product, not as a devotional product, all right? Textual criticism is the study of any written work when the original document is lost, destroyed, and or is inaccessible to us. The purpose of such a study is to ascertain the wording and the meaning of the original text. This study is accomplished by analyzing subsequent manuscripts or copies of the original text, which original text we no longer have. What does this mean? This means that you can be a biblical textual critic, you can be an atheist, an agnostic, theist, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu. One's religious persuasion doesn't have anything to do with the practice of textual criticism. In short, textual criticism is a methodology that seeks to capture or reconstitute an original text that we no longer have. Okay, so in order to resolve the conflicting passage in Mark, which is a slide we'll get to at the end of this presentation, we need to know something about the New Testament. And my primer on the New Testament has 4 parts. Of what does the New Testament consist? When was it written? Who wrote it? How was it written? And once we've answered those questions and I've given you the context of how the New Testament came about, then we can turn to resolving the conflicting passage in Mark. Was Jesus angry or compassionate with the leper? Okay, so question, just a minute. Question number 1, of what does the New Testament consist? The New Testament consists of 27 books. There are the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, allegedly written by those disciples about the life of Jesus. There are 21 books of doctrine or letters, also called epistles. 13 of the epistles in the New Testament are attributed to Paul. And there is 1 book of prophecy called the Book of Revelation. So those are the 27 books, okay, in the New Testament, in our New Testament today. The original gospel, scholars call the autograph. So everything after that is a copy of the autograph or a copy of a copy of a copy of the autograph. All right, moving on. When did our New Testament assume its present day format? I find this fascinating. The Sunday school version of the Gospels is that soon after the death of Jesus, the canonical New Testament simply appeared one day like Athena springing from the forehead of Zeus, okay? But nothing could be farther from the truth. In the first 3 centuries, there were dozens of Gospels regarding Jesus' life circulating throughout the Greco-Roman world and all competing to be admitted into the New Testament. Only 4 made it, obviously. Okay. The first reference in ancient writings to the New Testament, as we now know it, consisting of 27 books, is in a pastoral letter written by the Bishop of Alexandria named Athanasius in 367 CE, or over 300 years after Jesus' death. Okay, just think about that statistic for a minute, that it took over 300 years for our New Testament to assume the 27-book format, a long time. Okay, when were the Gospels written? Scholars are pretty much in agreement on this. Jesus was born about 4 BCE, was crucified circa or about 30 CE. The Christian narrative circulated by word of mouth for decades before any person committed the Christian narrative to writing. Scholars believe the Gospel Mark was written first, about 60 CE. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke were written about 20 to 25 years thereafter, 80 to 85 CE. And then the Gospel of John was written 95 CE. Okay. That's when the Gospels were written, according to the biblical scholars and textual critics. Next slide. Okay, what are the earliest copies of the New Testament in our possession? No autograph of any of the Gospels exists, okay? It's never been found. We presume that they were destroyed or simply perished. The following are the oldest New Testament, i.e. copied, manuscripts in existence. There is the Vatican manuscript that dates back to the 4th century, and it's resided in the Vatican Library since 1481 CE. So let's just think about that minute. Let's call the date when the manuscript was copied 360 AD, all right? That would mean that there are 300, and let's talk about the Gospel of Mark, which we think was written in 60 AD. That means there are 300 years of copies before we get to the Vatican manuscript. 300 years. Okay, how many copies did the Christian communities go through to get up to 360 AD? No one knows, but obviously there were a lot, 300 years. Okay, the next manuscript, the Sinaitic manuscript, also dates back to the 4th century and was discovered in a monastery in Egypt in 1844. And the third is the Alexandrian manuscript dating back to the 5th century and was discovered in the city of Alexandria, Egypt in the 17th century. Okay, next slide. Who wrote the 4 Gospels? This is an exciting thought, and there's a lot of scholarly ink has been shed trying to decide this. The Sunday school version of the authorship of the Gospel is as follows. Matthew was penned by Matthew, a tax collector and an apostle of Jesus. Mark was penned by Mark, a friend of the apostles and the secretary of Peter. John was penned by John, an apostle of Jesus. And Luke was penned by Luke, a traveling companion of Paul. Okay, that's the Sunday school version. Okay, the scholars or the textual critics reject the Sunday school version of gospel authorship for the following reasons. First of all, that none of the Gospels identify the author or who is writing the Gospel. They're all anonymously written, okay? Secondly, that most scholars believe that the disciples of Jesus were illiterate peasants and fishermen. They were from a backwater rural part of Palestine, Galilee, and they couldn't read or write. And if they couldn't read or write, how did they write the Gospels, right? So scholars also estimate that 10 to 3% of the Greco-Roman world were literate in the 1st century CE. Not many people. Okay, a third reason why textual critics or scholars believe that the Gospels were not written by the names we have on them today is that all of the Gospels were written in Greek. Okay, Jesus and the apostles spoke Aramaic, the common language of Palestine. And just with respect to the literacy, that scholars believe that most of the literate people lived in dense urban centers where there were schools and so on. And obviously Galilee was not an urban center. Okay, last reason, and more on this later, it'll become clear in about 2 or 3 slides. The Gospels also rely on previously written sources. So if an author, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, was an eyewitness to the Jesus life, why would the writer take almost all of his stories from a previously written source as opposed to simply saying, I witnessed this? I'm going to come back to that in case that is unclear. Okay. The biblical scholars' version of the gospel authorship. Okay, the Gospels, biblical scholars believe, were written and circulated anonymously for decades without having names on them. And authoritative names were later assigned to them by unknown figures in the early church. These unknown church figures attributed gospel authorship to purportedly eyewitnesses who personally knew Jesus in order to buttress the credibility of the Gospels. In short, the authorship attributed to the Gospels was the result, as scholars say, of pious wishes. And you may say, well, why did the Gospels' credibility need to be buttressed? Well, the answer to that is that in the first 300 years of the first millennium, there were at least 3 dozen other Gospels competing to be included in the New Testament and were circulating in the Greco-Roman world in the first 3 centuries. In short, Christian scholars needed to identify what became as the New Testament Gospels so that Christians would know what books the scholars were advocating and talking about. That's why they were given names, okay? For instance, the first identification of the Gospel of Mark being called that appears in the writings of a church father called Irenaeus around 180 to 185 CE. And he was a specialist in heresy called a heresiologist. So it was the Gospel of Mark circulated around, remember it was written in 60 AD, for 120 years without having a name. Okie doke. Next slide, just a minute, let me find my arrow. Okay, this is a fascinating talk, and let me see if I can articulate this quickly. How were the Gospels initially written? And this entails the synoptic problem, which I'm going to define in a moment. The 4 Gospels, as we know, are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. John is completely different, was written as the last Gospel, and doesn't follow the format, the parables, the kind of Jesus that's depicted in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic Gospels because they share the same language, the same stories, and the same sequence of stories. So the synoptic problem is to explain why these 3 Gospels are so much alike. Another way of saying that is who was copying whom, okay? To give an example of the synoptic issue here, let's imagine that we have 3 newspapers, 3 different newspapers, and all of them have a story about COVID-19. However, in each article, in each of the newspapers, let's call them newspapers 1, 2, and 3, each article has an identical paragraph in all 3 stories. And the textual critic would say, how is that possible? And the answer is, the textual critic would say, that's because the newspaper reporters in both article 1, 2, and 3 were copying a common source, okay? And that's why there is an identical paragraph in all 3 stories. The Gospels work the same way. And here, for instance, Matthew has language that is identical to the language in Mark, as Luke also has language that is identical in Mark. And so textual critics believe that Matthew and Luke copied, just like the newspaper example I gave you, copied from a common source, and that's why they have identical language. Okay, Matthew and Luke also share identical language from a biblical source that scholars call Q, standing for the German word Quelle, meaning source. Q, people believe, was a composite of Jesus' sayings. No one has discovered Q. We don't have a copy of it. But scholars conjecture that this written source existed, again, because Matthew and Luke have identical language from some other written source, and scholars believe that is Q. Okay, Luke also has a source that is just peculiar to him, and they call that L. And over here with Matthew, Matthew also has a source that is peculiar to Matthew. It could have been oral or it could have been written, and they call that M. So for the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Matthew borrowed from M, from Mark and Q, and Luke borrowed from Mark, Q, and L. Okay. I go back to the slide that I just showed several moments back in this fourth paragraph, and I want to make certain you understand this. So the scholars are saying, no, we don't believe that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew and then he personally witnessed the life of Jesus. That's the Sunday school version, but scholars disagree with that. And this is one of the reasons, and that is to say, if the author, let's say Matthew, was an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, why would he take almost all of his stories from a previously written source? Okay, and okay, here's Matthew. The written sources would be Mark, Q, or M. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why they think Matthew did not write Matthew and did not personally witness what he's talking about, because he's taking from other written documents, and as opposed to simply saying, I witnessed this, which Matthew didn't do. Okay, so I'm going to try to say that more in ordinary English in case I'm confusing it all. And let's imagine that in Matthew and Luke, there is language, Mary had a little lamb, Mary had a little lamb. And that identical language appears in Mark, Mary had a little lamb. Okay, dope. Whoop, hang on. How did that happen? Just a minute. All right, just a minute. It's jumping around. Okay, and let's assume that in Matthew and Luke, there is the identical language, the cow jumped over the moon. Okay, and that they're copying from a common source. And so scholars say that comes from Q. And then there's specific language that comes just to Luke, Mother Goose down here. There's specific language in Matthew, twinkle, twinkle, which comes from M. So the textual critic says, Mary had a little lamb, cow jumped over the moon, twinkle, twinkle, came from these written sources, okay, because the language is identical. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed that. Okay, what does the word variant mean? And we're getting, okay, the crescendo, the denouement of this is to resolve the textual ambiguity or conflict in chapter 1, verse 41 of the Gospel of Mark. That's what we're getting to, but we need to know what scholars mean by the word variant. Okay, the oldest copies of the New Testament, as we've already discussed, were copied 300 to 400 years after the events described in the Gospels. Okay, until Gutenberg came along in 1440 with his printing press, scribes, scriveners, monks copied the New Testament by hand. Presently, contemporary scholars possess over 15,000, think of that, 15,000 ancient manuscripts of the New Testament written in Greek and Latin. Without a doubt, the New Testament is the most frequently copied book in Western civilization, okay? So imagine that we have 15,000 copies of the manuscript of Mark, okay? And we line them all up from from Seabreeze Recreation Center all the way down to Lake Meona, okay? And so you're reviewing that. And so when one word in a sentence in the Gospel of Mark differs from the wording of the same sentence in another manuscript, keep in mind we've got 15,000 of them, this difference is called a variant. So scholars estimate that there are as many variants in the New Testament manuscripts as there are words in the New Testament. 200,000 to 400,000 variants. Okay, that's a lot of differences, okay, when you're comparing the 15,000 different manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark. Okay, so that brings us to the crux of this talk. So how in the world do we know what Jesus really said when we have so many variants in the manuscripts that differ, okay? Or stated otherwise, which variant in a manuscript is the one actually penned by the anonymous gospel author in the autograph, okay, in the original one? The art of how to interpret or resolve biblical textual variants is called hermeneutics or biblical exegesis. Okay. Biblical scholars have adopted a number of hermeneutic tools to discern and to choose which variant is the correct word that appears in a gospel. Of course, if a scholar decides that a variant is the correct word from the autograph, the word is not considered a variant, but is deemed the original or the correct word. So I'm going to mention 3 hermeneutic tools that textual critics use to resolve the conflict that we see in chapter 1, verse 41 of Mark. That's where we're going. We're getting close. Okay, the first hermeneutic tool is the earlier the better presumptive tool. And this is pretty self-evident. The logic of this principle is that as early Christians told stories about Jesus around the campfire, the more time that passed with such stories, the more likely that the storyteller altered the story. Accordingly, if a manuscript written in the 3rd century captures a story about Jesus, a manuscript reciting the same story, in quotes, with variants written in the 5th century would be considered less reliable by a textual critic. So I've playfully...
Scott, you're at 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. Okay, everybody, hang on. Okay, so I've playfully called this hermeneutic principle the telephone game on steroids. Okay, the second hermeneutic tool that textual critics use is the transcriptural presumptive tool. The logic of this principle is that as scribes encountered stories about Jesus that were difficult to understand or appeared to contradict the scribe's understanding of Jesus, who Jesus was, a scribe was inclined to simplify or alter the passage in order to make the passage easier to understand. So I have playfully called, whoops, just a minute, hang on, go back. I've playfully, let me get back to my slide, playfully called this hermeneutic principle, you've got to be kidding me, that can't be right presumption. Okay, the last one, the apologetic bias presumptive tool. Okay, this is a little subtle. During the first 3 centuries, Christianity competed with an overwhelmingly pagan polytheistic world, and people believed that worshiping the pagan gods made it more likely that your life would be better, crops would grow, that your health would be good, your family would be safe. And because monotheistic Christians refused to participate in this worship, pagans considered Christians dangerous and a threat to society. Pagan intellectuals attacked Christianity as a sexually profligate and cannibalistic religion. Okay, to conclude that slide, as a result of these attacks, and this presumptive tool will become clear in about 2 slides, Christian slides in the 1st and 2nd centuries altered their transcriptions of what was stated in the Gospels in order to rebut the pagans' attack on the Christian God. So I've called this hermeneutic principle the need to look presidential presumption. Okay, so in summary, the 3 exegetical tools. There's the telephone game on steroids. There, you've got to be kidding me, that can't be right. And there's the need to look presidential. Okay, finally, we get to our slide. A leper came to him, and we've read it before. Was Jesus angry or was he compassionate in healing the leper? So which was it? Okay, let's apply the 3 hermeneutic principles to these 2 manuscripts and decide which one was right and which one is wrong. Assume we have 2 manuscripts of Mark. Actually, we have 15,000. But let's call them Mark 01 and Mark 02. Mark 01 uses the word angry. Mark 02 uses the word compassionate. We ascertain that Mark 01 is the earlier manuscript. Using the earlier is better rule. The textual critic believes that Mark 01's wording is more likely to be correct and not the wording of Mark 02. Okay, but how did the word compassionate get into the text in the Gospel of Mark? Chapter 1, verse 41. Using the "you've got to be kidding me, that can't be right" presumption, textual critics speculate that a scribe found the angry reading of Jesus to be unsettling and felt that a compassionate Jesus was much more palatable. Thus, the scribe altered the text, thinking that the angry reading must have been a mistake. You've got to be kidding me, that can't be right. Okay. The last hermeneutic principle, and this is a little bit subtle, so bear with me. Mark has about 6 references to Jesus becoming angry in his gospel. Interestingly, both Matthew and Luke, written about 20 years after Mark, repeat the same angry stories from Mark, but they have no mention of Jesus becoming angry. They repeat the story, but anger is taken out. Neither do they use the compassionate language. Okay, if the compassionate language was first, as opposed to the angry language. Why would Matthew and Mark and Luke delete it? Or did the writers delete the angry language? And textual critics believe that Matthew and Luke deleted the angry language to buttress a theological bias. And this is a little subtle, but hang in there with me. Both pagans and Christians believed their divinities were not subject to petty and whimsical human emotions. They were above such things. In short, pagans and Christians expected their gods to act presidential, okay? Because Christianity was at war with and under attack by pagan intellectuals in the first 3 centuries CE, Matthew and Luke deleted the angry reference in Mark so that Jesus appeared more godlike, i.e. not petty. This alteration was then used as ammunition against the pagans' attacks that Jesus didn't spurn the leper with anger, but acted presidentially or appropriately godlike. Okay, so this alteration, i.e. omitting the word angry with respect to this third hermeneutic tool, is an apologetically or bias-driven variant and illustrates the third exegetical principle, the need to look presidential presumption. So, in summary, just a minute, the winner is Mark 1. Jesus was angry with the leper as opposed to responding to the leper with compassion. Why? Because Mark 1 is the earlier text. Secondly, because the compassionate reference appears to be an alteration caused by a scribe who was puzzled and bothered by what he thought to be a mistake in the manuscript he was copying. You know, oh my gosh, this can't be right, okay? And thirdly, because the deletion of the reference to anger in Mark was an apologetically driven alteration to make Jesus look presidential, which variant could then be used to refute the pagan's accusation that the Christian God was petty and unworthy of belief. So, next slide. We might ask, we've spent the last almost 25 minutes talking about the New Testament, and someone may say, who cares? Why study the New Testament? And Ehrman gives 4, I think, obvious reasons. One, culturally, the New Testament, as Lou mentioned at the beginning of our talk, is the most commonly purchased, widely read, and deeply cherished book in the history of Western civilization. The Bible is the best-selling book year in and year out. It's estimated that 25 million copies are sold every year. No other book comes close. It's been translated into over 230 different languages. Okay. Historically, as an institution, Christianity has had a greater impact on Western civilization, more so than any other institution in our history, socially, politically, and economically. With all of our COVID-19 free time, all of us have probably watched many Netflix movies, and I went through the Tudor series on Netflix, which is about Henry VIII, who was the English king in the 16th century. And I'm amazed, it's a fascinating series, but I'm amazed by how the Christian mythology completely controlled intellectual thought, social, political, and economic thought in medieval times. Okay, third reason, religiously, 8 out of 10 Americans believe that the New Testament is divinely inspired, contains the Word of God. And then the last reason that Ehrman suggests is literarily our greatest works of literature require an understanding of the New Testament. Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, Dickens, Tolstoy, T.S. Eliot, and hundreds of other authors have used the stories, themes, and language of the New Testament in their writings. And we just broke the world record in the fastest Christian primer ever given.
All right, thank you, Scott. Scott, can you unshare your slides? I want to see.
And Ian, do we have our first question?
Yes, we have Ralph.
Mute. I should be unmuted. A couple things. This is great. I really appreciate this presentation. You know, being a Christian for some years, I've wondered about the factuality of the New Testament, given that, you know, it was basically written significantly after the time that Jesus was actually you know, doing his ministry on earth. And, you know, this gives me even more insight as to, you know, what's there and why it's there and how it gets analyzed and all of that. I mean, the one comment I made in the breakout session was that a very strong perspective these days in Christianity is that God is love. He has perfect and infinite love, and therefore Jesus was also love, and he had infinite and perfect love, which probably brings up the issue about him being angry at times, which would be probably related to how others in this time were not, in, in our view these days, actually engaged in love. And I actually ran across an interesting YouTube video this morning that I was about 15 minutes long. It's worth watching from the perspective of understanding, the times. And it was a July 5th Sunday sermon by David Brooks at the Washington National Cathedral. It's on YouTube. And it's definitely worth watching because it basically talks about how Jesus was beauty in the storm and how, he's, looking for beauty in the storm today also, that we're in the midst of a, ongoing storms in the same way that Jesus was. So that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Hey, Peter.
Oh, well, Scott, I'm going to start it out by saying this is opinion and not a fact. And my opinion is that you did a great job. I really enjoyed it. Just one small point I want to ask you about. While clearly the analogy, or excuse me, the main point you made at the end, whether or not it was anger or compassion that Jesus had when he cured the leper, if he cured the leper. The first thing that struck me at the time was, people are conjecturing 60 or more years after an event occurred about what was in the mind of a person while they were actively doing a particular action. That seems to be a really strange thing to conjecture about. But what I wanted to ask you about, what you didn't seem to mention in your considerations, was actually the evolution of language itself. And when we use a word like anger or compassion, what was the actual Greek word or Latin word? It may be that whatever the word was that was used, or whatever the expression was, perhaps there was a change in the meanings of words, or the way the translation would occur subsequently. That's one of the elements you didn't consider, but have you looked into that at all?
Scott, would you care to comment? Did we lose Scott?
Great Scott.
Oh, shame on you.
Okay, there I am. Okay, Peter, that since I don't know Latin and I don't know ancient Greek, but again, those are fascinating questions. I mean, in this presentation, when the textual critic is trying to ascertain what Jesus said, okay, and again, let's take Mark, was Jesus angry or compassionate? Okay, keep in mind that the yardstick of which is correct is a document that was written about 60 AD, okay? And that goes, we're going back another 30 to 35 years of what Jesus said. So the closest we can get to Jesus is the gospel, the time the gospel was written. And language is a problem. Candidly, in defense of all of the quote variants that are in the Gospels, I think it's fair to say that 90% of them appear to be trivial, grammatical, spelling mistakes, translating a word incorrectly. But because I don't have the linguistic expertise, Peter, I really can't address or answer your question, though I think it's a fascinating question. Yeah.
Thank you, Scott. Ian, do we have enough?
Ask Mike Enright, please.
Hello, everyone. This Sunday at 10 o'clock, I'm giving a talk for the Humanist Group. You can get it online. Just contact Jay Kaplan, Jim Bucko, or me. It's called Vatican Scandals. So that will be this Sunday at 10 o'clock. Okay,
Oh,
Scott.
That will go out in the Civil Discourse email Wednesday.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yes,
Lou.
Mike?
Scott, you're getting better and better, especially at organizing. This was very tight and very well done. I'd just like to give you my experience with the Bible and stories. I had 12 years of a Catholic education. Every day there was an hour's instruction on religion. That's in first grade through 12th grade. And I never can remember being inspired by the biblical stories, whether it was Jonah or Noah or Moses or any of those stories. When I taught school, my third year of teaching, I taught a mythology class, and we had a book that had wonderful stories. They're relatively short. They're from Greek and Roman myths primarily, but also the Norse myths, Native American myths, Africa, Asia. Wonderful stories with themes and morals. And I think so many times we're just locked into our perspective, and we just assume there's a great deal of value in something like the New Testament. But there are other stories out there that are of equal or greater value.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay,
Fascinating.
Dave Dunlop?
I thought the topic was fascinating, and Scott, you did a great job.
Thank you.
One of the things that came out in our little breakout session, and by the way, I'm one of the 85% who really liked the breakout session. One of the things that came out in our breakout session was that the whole thing hinges on the objectivity and the accuracy of the very first writer or the very first observer. If they didn't get it right, from there on, it's all going to be wrong. But you have to assume maybe they got it right, and so these activities are worthwhile. So we have 15,000 manuscripts,
Right.
and 200 to 400,000 variants.
Right.
And if only 10% of those variants are significant, since
Okay.
90% are insignificant,
Right.
that still leaves something like 2,000 to 4,000 significant variants. And my question is, do we know, or do you know, is there a document, a book, thesaurus of sorts, that gives you Matthew, for example, or all four Gospels, showing each of those significant variants in one place?
Okay. I guess I'm unmuted. All right. Excellent
I can hear
question.
you.
I'm okay?
Yes.
You're fine.
And Dave, maybe you've heard of this, but let me introduce you to the Jesus Seminar, which was started by a scholar named Robert Funk in 1985, and it's still going on. And what Funk wanted to do was to find the historical Jesus in the Gospels, all right? What did Jesus really say or do? And you make an excellent point that, let's take the Gospel of Mark, if it was written 60 AD, okay, you know, it's talking about what Jesus did 30 years before that. And that's a lot of stories around the campfire, you know, for 30 years. But putting that aside for a moment, so Funk collected the best biblical scholars in the world in this Jesus Seminar, and they went through the New Testament and they voted on Jesus' sayings and his actions as to whether they believed the historical Jesus, in light of their research and expertise, really did that. And Funk would give the scholars 4 different colored beads. And maybe you know this, excuse me if I'm telling you something you already know. A red bead, a pink bead, a gray bead, and a black bead. And so they would take something that Jesus purportedly said, love your neighbor as yourself, okay? And if the scholar believed that, yes, Jesus absolutely said that, then he would put a red bead in the basket, okay? Hang on, I've lost, am I still on the screen?
Fine, you're fine.
Yes.
You're fine.
I'm fine, okay, I've lost, okay. And Dave, if the scholar believed that maybe, probably Jesus said that he would put a pink bead in the in the canister. If he thought Jesus probably did not say it, he put a gray bead. And if he thought Jesus didn't say it at all, no way, then he put in the black bead. Okay, just suffice to say, and I'm sorry I've lost my screen of everybody here. I'm back on my slides somehow. But suffice to say, if you go through Funk's book, The Five Gospels, there are very, very few sentences in the New Testament, according to Funk and his coterie of scholars, where they voted with a red bead. Very few. Say, Tim Prosdick. Tim, can you get me back so I can see everybody?
Okay, Ian, while they're doing that, can we have our next question?
Yes, it's Sarah. Sarah, please.
Yes.
Okay, there you are. There you are.
Hi, Scott.
Hi.
Hi. This has been an area of interest of mine for a long time, and I've never heard anybody present it the way you did, so I congratulate you.
Thank you.
Your organization's really good. I'd like your viewpoint, if you will, on three points. And I'll explain a little bit about how these come to me. I grew up in a traditionally Christian home, very much so, a long line of ministers. I went to a church college, and what was wonderful for me is the professor in our freshman Bible class came in and said, the Bible is myth and symbol. The Bible is myth and symbol. And that has ended up being my perspective. With that in mind, I've heard that just as the authors of the gospel are collective figures, that some of the figures are actually not really historical people. For example, Nebuchadnezzar, King Nebuchadnezzar, probably was a historical character. But people like Nicodemus, the tax collector who climbed up the tree to see Jesus, or Daniel, who was in the lion's den. So number one question, and I'll just go through the questions real quickly. Number one, what are your thoughts about some of the figures actually being representative of certain philosophies of the time, that there was no actual Daniel? Or if so, maybe he was a representative of, I'll just take a guess, Stoicism. So my first question, what about these figures who may or may not be historical? Second question has to do with the Gospels and your understanding of the conflict between Gospels as they are accepted and the Gnostic Gospels, one of which may have been written by Mary Magdalene. Any thoughts about that? And my third question is more factual. Aramaic is a dead language. Was that ever a written language? I don't know that. Any thoughts about that? I appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, excellent questions. I hope I can answer them quickly. With respect to the Bible consisting of myth and symbolism, what we in the 21st century perhaps forget is that the idea of objective history, recording things as they actually happen, that's a very recent concept. And so the Jews back 2,000 years ago, they didn't think of history in that way. Now that may be hard for us to get our minds wrapped around that. What do you mean? You know, history isn't recording things. Well, it wasn't. Jews were more concerned with the meaning of history, okay, as opposed to the actual events. And the example that I love to use is that in Matthew and Luke are the only two gospels where we have the nativity story, okay, Jesus being in a manger and following the star and the three wise men and all of that. Okay, I have one minister who happens to be my older brother, which I really enjoy. But Klein's interpretation of that, okay, you know, were there really three wise men, and did they really follow a star, and did they really find, you know, Jesus, you know, basically in a barn, okay? And Klein would say, you know, maybe that's not the purpose of that story. Here we have the three kings leaving their kingdoms, leaving their comfort zones, leaving where they're comfortable and they're powerful, and they find the sacred where they least expect it, okay, in a barn. So again, taking that, quote, historical story, maybe the point isn't really recording history, but the meaning of history. Okay, that's my response to question number one. Question number two, Gnostic Gospels. Okay, the Gnostic Gospels are distinctive because they don't focus on the resurrection of Jesus. They believe that salvation came about because Jesus was communicating to us special secret knowledge, okay? And people believe the Essenes were perhaps Gnostics. And with respect to the Gnostic Gospels, there are certainly many, many of them. I believe actually in 1945, when they discovered the Gospel of Thomas, I'm going to mispronounce this, Nag Hammadi in Lower Egypt, where they found this treasure trove, this cache of Gnostic Gospels. So the point being that in the first 3 centuries AD, that there were so many Gospels and they were all competing with one another to be included in the New Testament, okay? And only 4 made it, all right? And let me see, in terms of Aramaic being ever a written language, I believe it was, but I don't know much about that, Sarah. But fascinating questions. Boy, you're on the right path to truth.
Okay, Ivo?
Hi, thank you very much. Most stimulating. I thought the idea of the breakout rooms was good, but I suspected we need a little bit of guidance as to the kind of subject areas we might like to think about in breakout rooms. Because it took us a few minutes struggling with how do we get our conversation started. Enough of that. I'm a sort of failed Christian. I was brought up vaguely as a Christian. Now I'm very much an atheist. But I do participate in a regular Torah class run by the Chabad organization. And that has taught me, well, I'm skeptical, obviously, that Jews are used to the idea, I think, if I can speak on behalf of the Jewish people, of God being an angry person from time to time. This is not a wonderfully benevolent, loving super being. Like, for instance, he killed 250 people because they didn't like the idea of Aaron being the leader, the high priest. You know, he killed 250 people. So he was inclined to be angry. The Torah also has a section where God is angry with the angels because they argue with him about something. So there is that strand of anger as not being entirely unusual. So I'm sympathized with the idea that Jesus could have been angry. The other thing I would, and I think you've almost touched on this, is Jews, as well as having the Torah, have the Talmud and various writings therein and thereof over many centuries. In fact, about 2,000 years. And scribes have invested a lot of energy and intellectual power in thinking about what does the Torah mean? What did God actually mean by the things he wrote down? And I've always thought that was a bit lacking in Christianity, this deeper analysis of what's the underlying subject matter here. Not what was actually apparently written down, but what were they getting at? And I think you touched on that in your response to the last questions. That is extremely interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Bill?
Yeah, I was trying to get off because what I was going to ask is the same thing that's been pointed out before about the evolution of language and the effects of translation while all this was going on. But that's already been talked about, so I'll be quiet now.
Okay, next person.
Who's up next, Ian?
Next person. Marge, please.
Hi. I had a comment, a question, and a request. My comment is, I love the breakout rooms. I would suggest 6 people in a breakout room as opposed to 4. We were missing one of ours anyway, although I have an extra one here. And I agree with whoever said maybe some guidance as to how to begin the discussion. 1 or 2 questions which could be given even at the beginning of the presentation, so you kindly know what you want to ask as you hear Scott or whomever speak. So that's my comment. My request is, I know 1 or 2 people have talked about things that they recently saw. Someone, I think it was Ralph on YouTube or something. And it would be helpful if they found it helpful in regards to this same discussion, if they could give the information of what you search for where, so that if that's something we might also like to look at, we'd have that information. And then my last thing is just a quick question, and that is, this is our first time doing this with the Zoom. Does this get uploaded to YouTube or something afterwards if I wanted somebody else to hear it? Is there a way I have to do that?
Ian, can you explain that?
Sorry?
Can you explain how we record this and how they can find it?
Yes, we'll send out an invitation with the information on how you can get to record it.
The whole presentation and the discussion is recorded, and we will send out a link that you can use to get to it. It'll stay up on the cloud till the next meeting. So over the next 2 weeks, you can get it to people.
Thank you.
Okay, Kathy?
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Scott. You had made several mentions in your presentation about biblical scholars. So my question to you is, when did they start? They obviously didn't start when it was written. So was that another couple of 100 years after it was written? All of a sudden we have a new job. Now we're going to analyze. And who started it? And what did they study that made them scholars? I guess it's not like...
Kathy, I'd like to remind you that if something is written today, there'll be a critique of it tomorrow.
Okay, but a whole new field of work? I mean, there's not one biblical scholar. There's a lot of them.
Kathy, I guess a great question, and I suppose let me answer it in a bifurcated manner. This is hard to imagine really, but in the first 300 years of the millennium, the Christian fathers, as they're described now, everybody was trying to figure out what Jesus meant and was propounding different theories about who Jesus was and his relationship to God. And there was heterodoxy and orthodoxy, and it was changing constantly. It was really just a melding pot of different ideas. Okay, so they were the initial scholars. I'm really not certain why people found it so fascinating. I mean, there were wars over the personhood of Jesus Christ. I mean, how can you be a Jewish monotheist and yet still believe in the Trinity, and what was Jesus' relationship to God, and how did that relate to substance and personhood? All kind of talk like that. But let me fast forward really to the beginning of the 20th century. I think Albert Schweitzer wrote one of the first books on finding the historical Jesus. But biblical scholarship, and these are characters who know just a host of ancient languages, you know, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Syrian, lots of languages that were used back in the time of Jesus when these books were being written. And it seems like that kind of scholarship really picked up in the last 300 years.
Okay. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Ian, put me in the list, please.
Okay. Bud?
No, thanks. Scott, good job.
Thank you, Bud.
I'm always, as a non-believer, I'm always amazed at how people can accept the literal translation from all these different people from different languages, like you say, many thousands of different texts, and they, whatever is in their own book, that's the literal word of God that had to be accepted literally. I have a hard time imagining that. And I wonder what kind of training do these people get in divinity school about biblical scholarship that would give them a little bit better idea of what they're really dealing with.
Ehrman's response to that, the summary I just gave of his thinking, Ehrman contends that any freshman seminarian would be taught what Ehrman is talking about. It's Seminary 101, okay? Ehrman's bigger concern is that he's convinced that people who are ordained, people who get a degree in divinity, are exposed to this, is why no one talks about it. Okay, that puzzles Ehrman. You know, I suppose, even though God is not on trial here, many people perhaps would view textual criticism as a threat or as an attack to their religious beliefs. I think if someone, and there are people who believe this, if some people believe the New Testament is infallible, okay, or the Bible is infallible, that's hard to intellectually defend in light of the textual criticism world, such as with Mark. Was Jesus angry or was he compassionate? I mean, you know, what do you do when you have thousands and thousands of variants in the New Testament manuscripts? You know, how can you argue the New Testament is infallible? Are you okay, bud?
Yes.
Okay. Did somebody disappear?
That was Penny, our next speaker. She just fell off her chair. Penny, you okay?
No, I'm muting my phone. I muted my phone. And it fell.
There she is. Penny, how are you?
Hey, Scott, that was an interesting talk. I did enjoy it.
Good.
So if I can squish it into this time that I've got, this is more of a comment. It comes from The Zealot by Reza Aslan, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. And it speaks to part of what you talked about. So the apostles were tasked by Jesus to spread his message. They left Jerusalem and fanned out across the land bearing the good news, but they were severely limited in their inability to theologically expound because they could neither read nor write. The task of defining Jesus's message fell instead to a new crop of educated, urbanized, Greek-speaking diaspora Jews who would become the primary vehicles for the expansion of the new faith. As these extraordinary men and women, many of them immersed in Greek philosophy and Hellenistic thought, began to reinterpret Jesus's message so as to make it more palatable, both to their fellow Greek-speaking Jews and their Gentile neighbors in the diaspora. They gradually transformed Jesus from a revolutionary zealot to a Romanized demigod, from a man who tried and failed to free the Jews from Roman oppression to a celestial being wholly uninterested in any earthly matters. Now, paraphrase, Jesus's friends and relatives, the original Aramaic ones, didn't like this, and there was a great deal of discussion and open hostile adversaries. So it was a translation that wasn't even given to the apostles, as you correctly said. But I found it interesting that it was a whole educated, urbanized, Greek-speaking diaspora Jews who would become the primary vehicle to create Christianity.
That is beautifully put, and I have the same book. He is the author is Muslim and writes extremely well. And I think you just pointed out that, you know, something, you know, that's very obvious. You know, again, the New Testament was written in the Greek language. That wasn't even Jesus's language. His language was Aramaic. And then there's the whole world of Hellenistic philosophy that sort of gets into that too. I think it's fair to say, and Ehrman makes this point repeatedly, that Jesus, it was not Jesus' intention to start a new religion. Now Paul did, okay, and you know he was the proselytizer for the Gentiles, but I think scholars think that wasn't Jesus' intention.
No, he lived and died a Jew in the Jewish faith.
Well, he was a Jew. His Bible was the Old Testament.
Yeah. So.
What wonderful comments, Benny. Wonderful comments.
Okay, Laurie Bell. Laurie Bell.
Hi. Thank you, Scott. I really enjoyed your discussion today.
Thank you. Oh, I lost you. Lou, I lost her. Where'd you go?
Lost Laurie Bell.
Laurie, you need to unmute.
Laurie, unmute.
And I'd be able to. Let me see if I can find her.
I've got her.
You got her? Okay.
Can you hear me now again?
Okay. Yes, go ahead, Laurie.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I enjoyed the sessions, but Scott, I would have gladly ceded more time to you, but I know this subject is going to yield a lot more lectures. I was wondering how Josephus, or you said there weren't many historians, but a few, I'm sure, would be looked at. And number two, anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls that have changed some views? I went to look at them at the Maltz Museum up here in Ohio years ago, what they brought in. And somebody in that museum told me that they're trying to squelch some of it because it would turn Christianity on its ear. And after all, it is a business.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good comments and good questions. The Josephus was a Jew and a historian. And so he mentions Jesus of Nazareth in his history. There is also another church father, he's called the father of church history, and I should know his name. I'm going to say Irenaeus, but that's not quite right, who wrote a 3-volume set, maybe it was a 10-volume set. He lived in the 3rd century AD. So there are historians who mention Jesus, okay, who were Jews. Josephus was a Jew. With respect to the Dead Sea Scrolls found at Qumran, okay, in 1945 and thereafter, and there were about 11 caves. Keep in mind that the Dead Sea Scrolls are copies. Think of Qumran as the Xerox center of the old world, okay? And the Essenes, in order to be pure, they withdrew from society and created their own hippie commune. Okay, and what they copied were the Old Testament books. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, people were very excited about them because some of them were written at the time Jesus lived. Okay, so one can get an idea of what life, religious life, was like for a Jew in the 1st century AD. But the Dead Sea Scrolls specifically referred to Old Testament books, not New Testament books. New Testament had been written yet when the Essenes were around. And of course, when the Romans came through in 70 AD and destroyed Jerusalem, they wiped out the Essenes too. Did I answer your question?
Thank you.
Oh, all right.
Okay, Lou, you're next.
Scott, I think one of the problems with biblical scholarship is up until the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, it was absolutely forbidden. If you were not part of the church hierarchy, you weren't even allowed to read this in detail. So that it was a very controlled structure from about maybe 400 to 1500. It's the forbidden subject. You cannot discuss it. And if you did, you were afraid of being marked as a heretic, being excommunicated. And that was the core of most people's life, was the church at that time. So I think there's a big gap in the middle because you weren't allowed to. What did that change? How did that change? Is it the Reformation?
I think the Enlightenment in the 17th century. I think from the fall of Rome, which was in the 400s AD, up into the 17th century, the age of enlightenment with the Renaissance all of the thinkers, Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and all those characters, that our mindset regarding so many things changed. But you're absolutely right that from the fall of Rome up until the time of the Enlightenment, you know, if you had a heretical view of a biblical book, you were burned at the stake or excommunicated. Now, just interestingly, this is sort of a tag into what to your comment, but I find it very interesting that, of course, Martin Luther was in the 1500s, I believe. Okay, that the banner under which, you know, he created his perspective was sola scriptura. Okay, that we only need the Bible. This is the Protestant Reformation. Okay, but now think what happens. Think what happens when you have textual critics coming along and say, you're right, Protestant Reformation and everyone after that who's a Protestant, that you only need the Bible. You don't need intermediate, you don't need the Pope, you don't need the Catholic Church, etc. And then a textual critic comes along and says, but wait a minute, we're not certain that the Bible's correct. I mean, that can be pretty threatening.
Thank you.
Okay, our last question is from Jay.
Thank you. It was a good talk, Scott.
Thanks, Jay.
I have two quick points. Number one, what supposedly Josephus had written about Jesus.
Thank you. That's the name. That's the name. I misremembered it.
Has been debunked because that section of where he talks about Jesus was not in the way he wrote it all. So they don't believe that he wrote anything like that. But my real question is, if Jesus in his time walked on water, had miracles, performed miracles, why didn't any of the Jewish scholars, and there must have been a lot of them at that time, why didn't any of them write about this Savior, Jesus? We have nothing written by any of the Jewish scholars during Jesus' lifetime. That's it.
Let me see. I'm not certain if I can respond to that, Jay, though your first point is a good one, and Jim Bucko has talked about that in other contexts in terms of how Josephus mentioned Jesus of Nazareth in his writings. But the word Jew simply comes from someone who lives in Judea, okay? That's where the word Jew comes from. And so you say, Scott, why weren't there Jewish writers as opposed to Christian writers, I guess, writing about Jesus? Frankly, I'm sure there were, because there were certainly pagan intellectuals taking issue with Christianity and basically saying you ought to believe our gods and you shouldn't believe in the Christian God because he's not worthy of belief. So there was a great deal of competition in the first 3 centuries as to which God you should, or gods you should believe in. And I'm certain, I'm not a scholar on this, I'm certain that there were many Jewish writers who were taking issue with Christianity.
May I? You have to distinguish between Jewish scholars and the Jewish authority, which is the Sanhedrin, the official governing body of the temple and the Jewish faith at that point. They would not have documented anything other than possibly we held a meeting and decided this guy's a rebel and a heretic. And we have no evidence of any of their reports like that in any other cases. So it's not surprising that there are no official Jewish documents regarding Jesus at the time.
Okay, are we wrapped up?
I think we're wrapped up, yes.
Listen, we want to thank everyone for coming. We had at the start 100 people online. We really appreciate the support, appreciate the feedback on the breakouts. We're going to try to incorporate breakouts and polling in some of our future stuff. Our next meeting is August 3rd, and you'll be getting an invitation next week. At that meeting, Bill Lau is going to present The 2008 Mortgage Meltdown, Causes, Results, and Lessons Learned. So again, thanks to everybody for helping us to keep the club going.